Okay, I am Nora Barrows-Friedman. I'm here with Ali Abunimah. I want to let you know that this next segment contains frank discussions of alleged sexual violence. Last week, billionaire former Facebook executive Sheryl Sandberg released a film purporting to document mass rapes carried out by Hamas fighters on October 7th. The film, called Screams Before Silence, has been heavily promoted by such figures as former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, ostensibly progressive Congressman Ro Khanna, and of course the Israeli government, among many others. Writing in the Washington Post on April 29th, columnist Ruth Marcus urged her readers, quote, "You should watch it and speak out about how rape and gender violence were deployed as weapons of war, about breasts cut from bodies, about nails driven into a woman's vagina. It has become the latest vehicle to push Israel's claims of mass rape on October 7th, claims that Israel supporters continue to use to either distract from or justify Israel's ongoing U.S.-armed genocide in Gaza." Since its release, it has garnered almost 600,000 views on YouTube alone. We're going to take a detailed look at the film now, and Ali is going to show us how it is full of fabrications, distortions, and lies, and does not, in fact, present any new credible evidence to support Israel's claims. Ali, let's start by reminding viewers about the role Sheryl Sandberg has played in pushing this story prior to the release of the film.
Thanks, Nora. Yeah, Sheryl Sandberg has indeed been pushing this story since soon after October 7th. And regular viewers may remember that we encountered Sandberg back in February when she and Hillary Clinton headlined a seminar at none other than Columbia University to promote the mass rape hoax. Sandberg chaired a panel featuring Jeffrey Gettleman, the lead author of the notorious and now almost completely debunked New York Times article from December called Screams Without Words. I don't think that it's a coincidence that the title of Sandberg's film, Screams Before Silence, echoes the headline of that New York Times article. Let's take a look at Sheryl Sandberg introducing Jeffrey Gettleman at that Columbia University event back in February.
Gettleman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, foreign correspondent for the New York Times. For the past 20 years, he has covered every major conflict in more than 80 countries. Every so often, I get to talk to him in these places, and I can't believe what he's going through. His piece in December, called Screams Without Words, is the definitive piece on the sexual violence of October 7th. Incredibly hard to research, and we'll have a chance to talk about that.
As you just heard there, Sandberg praises the article Gettleman wrote with two Israeli co-authors as, quote, the definitive piece on the sexual violence of October 7th. But that's not the only praise she gives it. Here's another brief clip.
Back to you. So the recent piece you just wrote, Screamed Without Words, builds on all the work you've done over the decades and is incredibly comprehensive. I think you spoke to over 100 people for the piece.
Now, as I said, that was back on February 9th. And recall that by that point, much of Gettleman's piece had already been debunked. For example, we had addressed it here on this live stream right at the beginning of January. I'll just mention right now that a lot of the rape claims that are in Gettleman's story do not appear in the Sandberg film. And I'm going to come back and talk about that later.
Okay, let's talk about Sandberg's film, Screams Before Silence. Give us an overview. I watched it yesterday. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, we watched it. I actually watched it several times so that nobody else has to. But yeah, let's look at this claim that's right at the beginning of the film. And this is a screenshot from the film, and it says, eyewitnesses and investigators have reported that Hamas subjected women to sexual violence and rape before they were killed. Those who were taken hostage suffered and continue to suffer physical, mental, and sexual abuse at the hands of Hamas terrorists. Now, there's a couple of things to note here. First, with respect to what supposedly happened on October 7th, the film speaks only of eyewitnesses and investigators, but not living victims. 7 months after this event, they have still not identified a single survivor. The second thing to note is that the film does not claim that there were merely some isolated and individualized incidents of rape. It insists, and this point is hammered throughout the film, that there was a pre-planned campaign of mass rape ordered by the leadership of Hamas. This is important to keep in mind. Just like previous efforts to promote this narrative, this film does not provide credible evidence of even one rape, let alone mass rapes on October 7th. The film does not identify a single victim of the alleged mass rapes on October 7th, either living or dead. They do claim, as we shall see, that there were dozens of women who were raped and killed, but they can't put a name or a photo to any of them. There are also no interviews with, say, family members of a rape victim, living or dead. They keep telling us to believe Israeli women, but once again, there are no Israeli women we are being invited to believe as victims, except for one, and she is not the victim of an alleged rape on October 7th.
And who is that?
So the only person they produce as a victim of an alleged sexual assault is a woman called Amit Susana. And starting in late March, her story was heavily promoted by the New York Times and the Israeli government's propaganda apparatus. Here's a short clip of her in the Sandberg film describing how she was captured and taken to Gaza.
10 men around me. And my instinct was just to fight, to do what I can.
Later in the film, Susana describes a pretty harrowing experience, the one she told the New York Times about in March. As I said, she does not claim that she was sexually attacked on October 7th. She claims that while she was being held in Gaza for 55 days, one of her guards, whose name she gives as Muhammad, forced her on one occasion to perform an unspecified sexual act. But Susana only publicly revealed this account months after her return from Gaza and in the context of a highly coordinated campaign involving the New York Times and the Israeli government. So, for example, when Susana first spoke to the media back in January about her experience in Gaza, she never mentioned the alleged sexual assault. And her story was rolled out at the same time that the New York Times and other Western media were largely ignoring credible first-hand accounts of sexual violence against Palestinians by Israeli soldiers. So this one story got huge publicity while the testimonies of Palestinian women and men about sexual violence against them were just ignored. Now, Amit Susana does not claim that there are any witnesses to what she says she experienced in Gaza, so it's really impossible to verify or completely discount her claim. But the key point is that even if we take her account to be entirely true, it does not in any way support the main thesis of the film. Susana describes one individual taking advantage of his power over her in an isolated situation and on one single occasion. Nothing in her account, again, if we accept it as completely true, supports the claim that there was a pre-planned campaign of mass rape on October 7th, or even that there is such a campaign against the female Israeli soldiers who are still in Gaza after the civilian women were released in November. From the perspective of Sandberg and other Israeli propagandists, focusing on Amit Susana is, however, understandable because they do not have any other victim, not even one, from October 7th itself.
In the film, Sheryl Sandberg shows clips of various captured, supposedly Palestinian fighters confessing to rapes. But what can you tell us about that?
Well, again, in the absence of any identifiable victims, the Sandberg film includes footage supplied by Israel of supposed confessions by captured Palestinians, interrogated and almost certainly tortured by Israel. Torture by Israel is, of course, well documented, pervasive, and routine, and has dramatically increased since October 7th. The methods routinely used include inflicting physical and psychological torture and explicitly threatening to murder or rape relatives of a detainee if they do not provide the statements Israel demands. We have to be clear that confessions obtained or suspected to have been obtained under torture can never be considered credible evidence. And not even the New York Times and other Western publications that are always so eager to launder Israel's lies have cited them as evidence. You'll recall also that a few weeks ago we talked about the report written by Pramila Patten, the UN Secretary General's special advisor on sexual violence in conflict. And in an article for the Electronic Intifada, our colleague Asa Winstanley and I heavily criticized that report for its strong pro-Israel bias. But even that report was not willing to launder torture confessions. The Patten report actually states that the UN team did not consider accounts collected by Israeli intelligence bodies through, quote, interrogations of alleged perpetrators, despite some being offered, due to the mission team's inability in the time allotted to establish the due process rights of the accused persons and adequate authentication, end quote. Also, the human rights group Physicians for Human Rights Israel, which has unfortunately given undue credence to Israel's mass rape claims, has also warned that the so-called confessions were obtained by interrogations that included the use of torture, and thus it does not consider them valid. And even the Israeli police have had to admit that they could not match these so-called confessions with any victims. So this alone should discredit the entire film, but instead we see so-called progressives, as you said, people like Ro Khanna, and of course self-proclaimed champions of women's rights and human rights like Hillary Clinton, heavily promoting a film that shows prisoners who are tortured making confessions.
So, Ali, if there's no credible confessions and no firsthand accounts from alleged victims of rapes on October 7th, how does the film try and convince viewers that this is what happened?
Well, a lot of it is atmospheric. If you watch it, you'll see there's a lot of sort of doom and gloom music and Sheryl Sandberg crying and hugging people and people talking about terrible things that they experienced or witnessed on October 7th, none of which are rapes. But when it comes to the rapes, one tactic is just to assert that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence without actually showing any of it. So let's take a look at this clip of Israeli Police Superintendent Mirit Ben-Mayor talking to Sandberg.
And with clear instructions to kidnap as many, to rape as many, to humiliate as many, to murder as many. They came here with a mission, and they succeeded in the mission.
How much evidence is there of the crimes of October 7th?
There's a lot of evidence. We have over 200,000 visuals that we've collected. We have over 2,000 testimonies that have been taken. Among these evidence, we have substantial evidence for sexual violence that took place on the 7th of October.
So that might sound pretty convincing to an uninformed audience, but as we've said before on this live stream, Israel has never claimed and is still not claiming that there is a single piece of video that shows a rape taking place. And that is an extraordinary absence given the fact that you just heard once again that this was a systematic campaign of mass rape. But you do not have to take my word for it. Here's what the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported as recently as April 18th in an article that is actually trying to boost, not debunk, the mass rape claims. And I quote from Haaretz, it says, from inquiries put to 3 bodies in the defense establishment by Haaretz, it emerges that the intelligence material collected by the police and the intelligence bodies, including footage from terrorists' body cameras, does not contain visual documentation of any acts of rape themselves. End quote. So here's another example of a claim that there is just a ton of evidence where none exists. This is a woman called Shari Mendez, who is described as an Israeli army reservist who was at the Shura military base that was being used as a makeshift morgue on October 7th.
The Shura base, which is where all the victims of the October 7th massacre were brought, there were body bags lining the corridors from the floor to the ceiling on both sides. And we never knew what we would see. We never knew what the level of the atrocity would be inside the body bag. As we did more and more of what we were tasked to do, we realized that women not just murdered, women were shot in the head so many times that it seemed like there was an intention, an objective to obliterate their faces. Most often families couldn't be shown the faces of their daughters. And we began to see that some of it was sexual in nature, directly targeted sexual violence. Some came in with no clothing and mostly very bloody underwear.
Did this feel systematic to you?
Yes, it did seem systematic to use sexual violence as a weapon of war.
So now let's go back to that April 18th article in Haaretz, and here's what it says, quote, "At the Shura base, to which most of the bodies were taken for purposes of identification, there were 5 forensic pathologists at work. In that capacity, they also examined bodies that arrived completely or partially naked in order to examine the possibility of rape. According to a source knowledgeable about the details, there were no signs on any of those bodies attesting to sexual relations having taken place or of mutilation of genitalia." End quote. The article also says that there were police forensic teams at the Shura base, and then it says, quote, "These teams did not document a single case of sexual assault or cases of genital mutilation," end quote. And let's also go back to the UN report, which says that the UN team examined thousands of photos and video clips provided by the Israelis. The UN report says, quote, "In the medico-legal assessment of available photos and videos, no tangible indications of rape could be identified," end quote. So Shari Mendez is just a liar.
And there's no forensic evidence either. What are some of the other tactics that the film uses to try and convince viewers that we're dealing with something real here, besides the moody music and the close-up shots of Sheryl Sandberg patting the backs of people?
There is a huge emphasis on trying to shock viewers with claims that witnesses observed mutilated bodies with signs of sexual violence, including the insertion of objects such as iron bars and nails into the genitalia and around the groins of victims. Another horrific claim is that bodies were found in positions that indicated that victims had been raped, for example, with their legs spread apart. I want to emphasize that absolutely none of these claims are being made based on proper forensic examinations or by qualified experts. So let's look at a few clips from the film. And again, I have to warn that the things being described are pretty explicit and horrible. Let's take a look at this first clip.
Cut to pieces. Cut to pieces. You cannot identify if it's a man or woman. Everything was ripped.
ראיתי גופות שרופות, גם של גברים, גם של בנות.
כשאתה רואה אדם, גבר או אישה, שהגופה השרופה שלו היא בתנועת התכווצות, בתנועת התגוננות, אתה מבין שקודם שרפו ואחר כך הם מתו.
lot of the bodies were naked, totally.
In your experience, how often have you found naked bodies?
Never. Never.
When I got out, I saw so many bodies. Their shirts were ripped off, and girls without skirts, without pants, their legs were spreaded. They were abused. The bodies were abused.
מה שראיתי שם זה דברים שלא אנושיים. אם זה גופות של בחורות שהבגדים שלהם קרועים, איזושהי פוזיציה, את יודעת, שהיא שוכבת על הגב ורגליים פתוחות. היה גם איזה אחת שאת רואה ממש על פגה של אוטו, מכופפת עם מכנס למטה. אתה רואה גופה של בחורה עם בגדים קרועים ועם איברים כרותים כאילו. אז אתה אומר לעצמך, מה, גם אנסו אותה וגם שחטו אותה וגם ביטרו אותה, מה עוד יכולים לעשות לבן אדם כאילו?
Yeah, so the people we just saw in that clip, in order of first appearance, was 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 of ZAKA, a Jewish group that recovers bodies for burial, and we'll come back to them later. He is followed by Elad Avraham, who worked as a security guard at the Supernova rave, that famous rave a few miles from Gaza, and then Chaim Otmazgin, also of ZAKA, and finally Tali Binner, a woman who survived the Supernova rave. And these are really horrific claims. And for those who are listening and couldn't read the subtitles in the Hebrew section, the account in Hebrew was similar to what you heard in English. It was talking about burned, mutilated bodies, and that kind of thing that the person assumes indicates rapes. But again, this person is not an expert. Now, let's watch a bit more of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 from ZAKA.
When we picked up the mattress, we found her body. This woman, we could not identify her from her face. She was naked wholly. And she had nails around her female organs.
It's quite a claim.
Yeah. And then now there's more, unfortunately. This is a clip of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 again, and Chaim Otmazgin of ZAKA, showing photos to Sheryl Sandberg that they claim show evidence of some of the horrors they just described. Let's look at that.
Okay, I'd like to see some of what you saw.
אנחנו רואים כאן בתמונה אישה שקרעו לה את המכנסיים, ירו בה במפסעה.
As you can see, the body was brutal in different stages. This is a part of the breast.
זו אישה שירו לה כאן, זאת אישה שירו לה כאן.
Over here, and over here, and over here.
Oh my God.
Of course, we don't see those photos ourselves.
That's right. That's right. And it continues for that a little bit longer, but it's more of the same. And again, Otmazgin, who's speaking in Hebrew, he's talking about, things inserted around the groin area. But as you say, at no point do we see those photos that they're showing to Sheryl Sandberg ourselves. And then finally, this is a clip of a man called Ramy Davidian, who claims to have single-handedly rescued hundreds of people from that supernova rave on October 7th.
ראיתי בחורות קשורות עם הידיים גופות. מישהו רצח אותם, אנס אותם, התעלל בהם, פה בעצים האלה. הרגליים שלהם היו פתוחות. מי שרואה זה יודע שהתעללו בבנות. מישהו הפשיט אותם, מישהו אנס אותם. והחדירו לעברים הפנימיים שלהם כל מיני דברים, כמו קרשים, כמו ברזלים. מעל 30 בנות נרצחו ונאנסו פה. הייתי צריך לסגור את הרגליים שלהם, לכסות את הגופות שלהם. שאף אחד לא יראה מה שאני ראיתי. אף אחד. אף אחד לא יכול לראות דברים כאלה.
It's okay.
I don't even know what to say about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, just to summarize for those who are
Yeah.
listening and couldn't read the subtitles. So Ramy, Davidian, they're standing in the forest where this supernova rave took place, and he claims that he saw women tied to trees, who had been raped, who had been burned, who had had objects like iron rods and wooden boards inserted into their private parts. And then he says that, I mean, no one else was around, according to him. It was just him. And then he says what he did is that if their legs, again, I'm sorry about how graphic this is, but he, if their legs were spread, he closed their legs, he covered everything up, and he said, so no one else could see. No one else could see. So what's interesting about that is if we are to believe what he's saying, then he is admitting that he actually tampered with a major crime scene in order to destroy the evidence of the things he says he saw, so that no one else could ever see them. And that turns out to be very convenient indeed, because Ramy Davidian is a huge liar.
I know you have more to say about him, Ramy Davidian, and some of these other characters that we just saw in that in those clips. But let's start with those claims themselves. Why do you think they are not credible?
Right. First, let's go back to that UN report again by Pramila Patten, the UN Secretary General's special representative on sexual violence and armed conflict. And here's what it says about the claims about objects being inserted into people's private parts. This is paragraph 65 of the report, which actually rejects a number of the most prominent Israeli atrocity claims about October 7th. But look at that last sentence. It says, quote, allegations of objects found inserted in female genital organs also could not be verified by the mission team due in large part to the limited availability and low quality of imagery. And then this is paragraph 47 of the same UN report, which addresses the claims about the positions in which bodies were allegedly observed. It points to, quote, erroneous interpretations of the state of bodies by some volunteer first responders without relevant qualifications and expertise. Some examples include mistaking post-mortem pugilistic posturing, a boxer-like body posture with flexed elbows, clenched fists, spread legs, and flexed knees due to burn damage as indicative of sexual violence, misinterpreting anal dilation due to post-mortem changes as indicative of anal penetration, and mischaracterizing grazing gunshot wounds to genitalia as targeted genital mutilation using knives. End quote. And those are all precisely things that you heard people in the Sandberg film saying, especially the people from ZAKA. You saw Chaim Mazgin claiming that he saw people with clenched fists like this as if they were trying to defend themselves. And you just heard what the UN report said about that. Now, I also want you to keep in mind those words, burn damage, because so many of the people in this film refer to bodies being burned and torn apart. And what is the most likely explanation for that? I'd suggest that the obvious explanation, one the film doesn't discuss at all, is Israel's massive and indiscriminate use of helicopter gunships and other powerful weapons that cause precisely the kind of injuries described by the people in the film and the UN report. Remember that the Israeli police have already admitted that Israel fired on people at the supernova rave using Apache helicopters, and of course, not just at the supernova rave. Dozens of Apaches were firing indiscriminately. And as we at the Electronic Intifada have reported many times, all based on Israeli sources, Israel applied the so-called Hannibal Directive on October 7th, a military doctrine that allows Israel to kill its own people rather than allowing them to be captured by an enemy.
Right. So the UN has rejected the claims about objects being inserted into bodies, systematically, and the mutilation of genitals. But what are other people saying?
Yeah, there are several examples of even generally pro-Israel media sources looking at the so-called evidence and concluding that these claims are simply not credible. So let's take a look, for example, at this March 5th article from NBC News about the UN report on alleged sexual violence on October 7th. And right there, you can see that NBC itself looked at the materials Israel gave to the UN team and that supposedly show objects inserted into women's genitalia. And NBC says, quote, NBC News was also shown the photos, but could not independently confirm that nails or a knife had been inserted in the women's bodies based solely on the images, end quote. And even Israel's Haaretz newspaper is unable to swallow the claims in that April 18th article that is actually trying to support the contention that the mass rapes took place. Haaretz was apparently shown the same photos by 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 that we just saw Sheryl Sandberg looking at. Haaretz says, quote, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 showed several of the photographs in his possession to Haaretz, including the one said to show nails having been inserted into the groin. The photograph was taken almost a week after the massacre and is definitely of poor quality. The possibility that what is depicted is indeed nails seems reasonable, certainly in combination with his testimony, but it's impossible to determine this unequivocally, end quote. So Haaretz is clearly trying to put the best possible spin on this to support 𝐓𝐡𝐞's claims, but even they are unwilling to endorse them.
You said you wanted to take a closer look at some of these characters, including, of course, the ZAKA volunteers. Who do you want to start with?
Well, let's start with 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜. And many viewers will already recognize that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 works for ZAKA, the Jewish extremist group whose members have been marketed worldwide as first responders in order to give them more credibility. That's why they see them in those yellow vests. You're supposed to think that these are selfless, rescuers. In fact, what members of ZAKA do is collect bodies and body parts from scenes of disasters or violence in order to bury them. Regular viewers will also know that ZAKA and its members were responsible for some of the most notorious atrocity propaganda since October 7th, including the totally false and disproven claim about a pregnant woman having the fetus cut out of her, and the stories of children being tied together and burned. None of that happened. Now, the well-known lies of ZAKA ought to be enough to discredit anyone from that organization, but it's particularly absurd for 𝐓𝐡𝐞 to be put forward as a champion of victims of sexual assault. Now, ZAKA was founded by a Jewish extremist with a history of terrorist violence, a man called Yehuda Meshi Zahav. And here I want to thank our colleague David Sheen for allowing me to use some of his background research on ZAKA and 𝐓𝐡𝐞 that he's done for a forthcoming article about October 7th atrocity propaganda. So during the 1980s, the founder of ZAKA, Yehuda Meshi Zahav, led Keshet, a gang of ultra-Orthodox extremists that terrorized Jewish residents of Jerusalem to punish them for using electricity on the Sabbath, for displaying photographs of females, and for selling secular newspapers. Meshi Zahav later went on to found ZAKA and ran it for 3 decades. In 2021, Israeli police opened an investigation into allegations that Meshi Zahav used his power, first as head of Keshet and then as the head of ZAKA, to commit violent sex crimes against adults and children, male and female, for over 4 decades. Many of his victims finally had the courage to come forward. Take a look at this article from Ynet, one of Israel's biggest news outlets, and this is from March 2021. You can see there that Meshi Zahav's horrific sex crimes against children were an open secret in the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox community, and many people were even calling him the Haredi Jeffrey Epstein. A few weeks after the police investigation into Meshi Zahav's sex crimes was opened, he attempted suicide, and in fact, he died a year later. And while all of his horrible crimes were being revealed and investigated, one of his chief public defenders was none other than his ZAKA colleague, Chaim Ot-Mazgin. Ot-Mazgin even told Israeli army radio that Meshi Zahav was the victim of blackmail by his accusers, and that, quote, the last thing he is capable of doing is hurting others, end quote. So there you have it. Chaim Ot-Mazgin from the discredited extremist group ZAKA is one of Sheryl Sandberg's star witnesses in her film defending alleged victims of rape. But he himself is a staunch defender of a man credibly accused of raping dozens of children over a period spanning 4 decades.
It's unbearable. You also said you wanted to talk more about Ramy Davidian, the man we saw just a few minutes ago who claimed to see women tied to trees and various objects inserted into them.
Yes. Interestingly, Ramy Davidian has already told his story, or rather stories, since the versions seem to change constantly. And here he is, for example, featured on a website called Humans of Tel Aviv, giving his account of October 7th. He is identified not as a first responder like in the Sandberg film, but as a farmer from Moshav Patish, a Zionist colonial settlement a few miles east of the boundary with Gaza. In that account, Davidian claims that he helped rescue hundreds of people from the supernova rave, including one young woman in particular. And this is what he's quoted as saying. I got a location from Rotem, one of the girls who escaped the party, and she texted me that she was hiding behind a tree. I drove to her location, honking my car so she could hear me approaching her. When I got to her location, I saw she was surrounded by 5 terrorists. I didn't flinch and shouted at them in Arabic, Ahlan, my name is Abu Ramy. I'm Muslim, and it's better that you give the girl to me and escape from here as fast as you can because the whole area is full of armed security forces. I wasn't afraid. It was pure instincts. Luckily, they thought I was a Bedouin, and because they were already on the run, they gave me the girl to me and ran off, end quote. Now, I found that Davidian has told this story, this version of the rescue, countless times in interviews. But he also gave his account in a video posted on the YouTube channel of the World Mizrahi Organization in December. It's a 5-minute video, but we're just going to watch a short clip where he tells the tale of his heroic rescue of that woman.
חילצתי מספר בנות, הם אמרו לי שחברה שלהם תקועה תחת איזשהו ואדי באיזשהו מקום, ולא היה קליטה, היה קשה מאוד להגיע אליה. והיא בוכה, מתחננת שאני אציל אותה. ואז אמרתי, טוב, אני מתחיל לצפצף עם האוטו, ככל שאת שומעת שזה מתגבר, את מכוונת אותי כן, 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 הצלחתי להגיע אליה. התחלתי לרוץ, ראיתי אותה עם 5 או 6 גברים. הסתכלתי צדדים, ראיתי נשקים. ואז הבנתי שהם מחבלים. לא יודע מאיפה את הכוחות. מצאתי שטוצר של ממטרה, רק חקלאי יודע מה זה שטוצר. הצלחתי להשכיב אותם ברצפה, הכנסתי אותה לאוטו, והבאתי אותה אליי הביתה, ועוד פעם חזרתי לשטח. זה נז, האישה הזו ניצלה. ניצלה. אני רוצה את הזכות הזאת. אני לא צריך את הזכות הזאת אף פעם. לא עשיתי את זה בזכות.
As you can see there, Ramy Davidian is really good at turning on the waterworks in front of the camera.
Yeah.
But now I'm going to read the English subtitles again for those who are listening rather than watching. He says, In one case, I rescued several girls. They told me their friend was stuck in a wadi in the middle of nowhere. There was no cell phone reception. It was very difficult to reach her. And she cried, begging me to save her. Then I said, fine, I'll start honking with the car, and the louder it gets, you direct me. Yes, yes, yes. I managed to reach her. I started running. I saw her with 5 or 6 men. I looked to the sides. I saw weapons. Then I realized they were terrorists. I don't know where I got the strength from. I found a pipe of a sprinkler. Only a farmer knows what that is. I managed to knock them to the ground. I put her in the car, brought her to my house, and once again returned to the area. It's a miracle that this woman was saved. I don't want that merit. I don't ever want that merit. I didn't do it for the merit, end quote. So as you can see there, what you immediately notice there is that these accounts are very different. In the first one, he somehow scares off the 5 armed terrorists who've supposedly come to kill everyone in sight just by scolding them in Arabic. He doesn't say anything about fighting them off with a pipe. He just managed to either charm them or scare them or convince them by pretending to be a Muslim. He is in fact Jewish, but he says he pretended to be a Muslim. In the second story, he heroically knocks 5 armed terrorists, as he calls them, to the ground with nothing but a piece of pipe. I mean, what do you think? How credible is that?
I mean, he's watched a lot of movies.
Right. This is like a script from a superhero movie.
Yeah.
So he's clearly not a very credible witness. And it's also notable that in the vast majority of his interviews that I saw, Davidian makes no claims whatsoever about seeing any signs of sexual violence. The earliest instance I could find of Davidian claiming to have seen anything related to sexual violence, the kind of things he describes to Sheryl Sandberg, date from early February, 4 months after October 7th, in a report from the Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel, an organization that has played a key role in trying to launder the mass rape hoax. And the last thing I'll say about Ramy Davidian is that even if he can't keep his stories straight, he does seem to be enjoying the limelight. He's become a sort of a minor celebrity in Israel, doing speaking events like this one in April, where for the price of 60 shekels, that's about $15, you can go and listen to him tell his tales of heroism. And he's even gone on a speaking tour of Italy recently.
Right, except he doesn't want any merit, as he says.
No, a very, very modest character.
Yeah. Are there other characters in the film that you want to highlight?
Yeah, we don't have time to talk about all of them, but none of them are really any more convincing than what we've seen. But I'm going to mention a couple. Sandberg interviews a woman called Tali Binner, a survivor of the violence at the supernova rave, and we saw a little clip of her earlier. Binner says she was hiding in a caravan, or a trailer as people in North America call it, for hours with 3 friends on October 7th. And here's a clip of her telling Sandberg what happened.
After 1 hour that we were in the trailer, I started to hear yelling of women. I heard a girl that started to yell for a long time. It was like, please don't, no, stop. No. It was like she was asking someone to stop. What can they stop? Someone is abusing her, someone touching her, someone is doing something.
How do you know that? Or why do you think that?
I know how it sounds. Like, I can understand how it sounds. There's no way that women will scream that loud for so long if it's not for asking for help because someone is doing something sexually to her.
So at no point does Tali Binner claim that she saw any of these rapes taking place. And as I said, she claims that there were other people hiding in the caravan with her. Presumably, they would have heard the same things she says she heard, but they do not appear in the film to corroborate what she says. And I did some research, and as far as I could find, this is the first time that Tali Bineh claims to have been not so much an eyewitness, but an ear witness to rapes. But it is not her first time talking to the media. She was interviewed on Israel's Channel 13 on November 11th, and she gives her account of hiding in the caravan. But during that interview, which is in Hebrew, she does not mention or imply anything whatsoever about sexual violence. And we could find no, and that on the screen you just see is her on Channel 13 back in November. And I could find no previous interview or statement from Tali Bineh making any allegation that she was a witness to any kind of sexual assault. And another person that we see in the Sandberg film is Raz Cohen. He's a familiar face who appeared in Jeffrey Gettleman's New York Times story and has given lots of interviews since October 7th with a constantly changing story about a supposed rape he witnessed. In the Sandberg film, he gives a very brief, vague version of his discredited account. And I think I'll simply say that people could go back and watch a segment on the Jeffrey Gettleman piece that we did on the live stream in January to get the full picture about Cohen and why he is not a credible witness.
Yeah. Speaking of the discredited Jeffrey Gettleman piece in the New York Times from December, you said you wanted to talk more about that. How does this tie into the film, apart from it being very similarly titled?
As we saw at the beginning of our discussion, Sheryl Sandberg was still praising Gettleman's piece in February at that event at Columbia University. She was holding it up as this amazing, exemplary piece of journalism. So you would think that many of the main examples of alleged rape that Gettleman wrote about would be highlighted in Sandberg's film. But many of the most lurid stories Gettleman and his Israeli co-authors wrote about are completely absent from the film. There is one, however, that is given a very short treatment in the film, and it's very telling how little attention it gets. Let's take a look at that clip.
Who stepped forward, a young woman who hid in the bushes, and described that very close to her, a few yards from her, there was a group of Hamas terrorists who pulled by the hair another woman who was stripped from the waist down.
הוא מושך לה בשיער, היה לה שיער ארוך, הוא מושך לה בשיער. היא לא לבושה, ובעצם אני מבינה שהוא אנס אותה. הוא בעצם משנע אותה. כאילו, ממש אני זוכרת את התנועה הזאת. ואז מעבירים אותה לעוד מישהו, והוא חותך לה את השד. הוא חותך לה את השד, הוא זורק את זה על הכביש, הם משחקים עם זה.
So that woman speaking in Hebrew with the blurred face is the one identified by Jeffrey Gettleman only by the first name Sapir. And for those who are listening, she describes hiding in a ditch and seeing Hamas fighters rape a woman, and then one of them cuts off her breast and tosses it on the road, and then they toss the breast around and play with it like a ball. This is a claim that has been repeated by countless media outlets over the last 6 months. The video of her speaking, and it's a longer video originally, was actually presented at a press conference by the Israeli police soon after October 7th. In the same video, Sapir claims that she saw the Hamas men beheading several women and dancing around with the detached heads. That is not mentioned in Sandberg's film because it totally discredits Sapir's account. As we pointed out in our January segment on the Gettleman piece, this could not have happened without leaving masses of physical evidence, including huge amounts of blood and DNA. And of course, where are the severed heads and the headless bodies? Gettleman was challenged about this after his original Screams Without Words article, which was published on December 28th. How could the Times have published such an extraordinary, outlandish claim without any corroboration whatsoever? The New York Times published a follow-up piece by Gattelman and his Israeli co-authors Anat Schwartz and Adam Seller on January 29th to try to repair the damage. And it contains this quite extraordinary claim. The police said they found Sapir's bag where she said she had been hiding and women's clothing near where she said the rapes occurred. And 3 severed heads were found farther away near the bodies of assailants in military fatigues, Israeli officials said without providing more detail, end quote. And I mean, that's stunning. As far as I know, of course, none of that was mentioned in the first article, which Jeffrey Gattelman claims they spent months on and interviewed 150 people. It never occurred to them to ask the Israeli police, well, do you have any evidence? But conveniently, the Israeli police said for his follow-up article after he was criticized, oh yeah, by the way, we did find the heads. But as far as I know, Jeffrey Gattelman and the New York Times are the only outlets to ever claim that the Israeli police found 3 severed heads. That has never been reported in Israeli media as far as I've been able to find. And you can imagine that this would be a huge story. You would have seen it in multiple outlets, not just in Israel, but all over the world. Gattelman just dropped it in passing. He doesn't say if he asked the police if they have crime scene photos of these heads or women's clothes or of the alleged assailants that were found dead. There's been no claim that there is any DNA evidence. It's just a passing sentence in Gattelman's second article, and there has been no follow-up by the New York Times. Surely, if these heads existed, the story told by Sapir would have been a central part of Sandberg's film. Surely the police superintendent that we saw talking about how much evidence there is would have specifically mentioned this shocking crime and crime scene and all the evidence. Surely the women would have been identified. But instead, it's just mentioned briefly near the end of the film with no mention of the severed heads whatsoever. I'll also mention that Gattelman claimed that there was a second eyewitness to what Sapir said she saw, a man named Ura Carroll. But as we showed in our segment on the New York Times piece back in January, Carroll had previously told Israeli media that he did not see any of this taking place, but only that Sapir had told him about it. And he does not make an appearance in the Sandberg film either. So the story of the dancing Hamas men with the severed heads has just disappeared.
I mean, I just keep remembering Gattelman when he was being interviewed by Sheryl Sandberg at Columbia University all those months ago, saying that as a journalist, it's not his job to provide evidence. He just relays information that he's given. Extraordinary. What are some of the stories that were in the Gattelman piece in the New York Times that do not appear in the Sandberg film?
Right. The first one, of course, is the case of Gal Abdush, an Israeli woman who was killed on October 7th. Gattelman made her the poster child victim of the alleged mass rape, but that story totally fell apart when Gal Abdush's family repudiated it. As Mondo Ice reported within days of the publication of the original story, members of Gal Abdush's family said they'd never been shown any evidence that Abdush was raped, that the known facts about her final moments made it impossible, and that the New York Times had manipulated and deceived the family. Another major alleged case Gattelman and his co-authors highlighted was that of 2 teenage girls who were supposedly found murdered and raped in Kibbutz Be'eri, and that there was semen on one of their bodies. That story was already debunked at the time we talked about the New York Times article on this live stream again at the beginning of January. But since then, it has been comprehensively disproven by other publications as well, including The Intercept and even the New York Times itself. It simply never happened. And there you see a headline from March 4th in The Intercept: Kibbutz Be'eri rejects story in New York Times October 7th expose. They were not sexually abused. It's not true, said the kibbutz spokesperson of one of the stories featured in the paper's controversial article. And again, that's referring to the story of these two teenage girls in Kibbutz Be'eri. And you can also see right here, we'll show the New York Times itself reporting on March 25th that, quote, new video has surfaced that undercuts the account of an Israeli military paramedic who said two teenagers killed in the Hamas-led terrorist attack on October 7th were sexually assaulted. And then a bit further down in the same article, the Times says, quote, Nili Bar Sinai, a member of a group from the kibbutz that looked into the claims of sexual assault at the house, said, this story is false. Reached by the Times, the medic declined to say whether he still stood by the account, saying he would like to put the attacks behind him. End quote. I bet he would like to put that behind him. But strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, the New York Times is still refusing to retract the Gettleman piece. But their pretense that everything is okay is not making the scandal go away. This week, more than 50 tenured professors from top journalism schools wrote to the New York Times urging them to, quote, immediately commission a group of journalism experts to conduct a thorough and full independent review of the reporting, editing, and publishing processes for this story and release a report of the findings. And end quote there. And I'd just like to remind viewers that it was us here at the Electronic Intifada and a tiny handful of other independent outlets, including Mondoweiss, The Grey Zone, and then much later The Intercept, who raised the alarm about this story right from the start. I also want to acknowledge here the research by 𝐓𝐡𝐞, the anonymous user of Twitter or X, who has done first-rate work throughout in debunking this hoax. And there are other individuals on Twitter as well who uncovered important things. For example, the repudiation of the Gal Abdush story by her sister Miral Alter. Their research helped me with today's segment as well. I think that the fact that the key claims that were in Gettleman's story are completely absent from the Sheryl Sandberg film is effectively an admission that they are totally false. Not even Sheryl Sandberg is prepared to stand by them. But I think her failure to acknowledge anywhere in the film how much false and debunked reporting there has been, false reporting that she publicly endorsed at that Columbia event in February. This reveals that she never set out to make a documentary, but a piece of atrocity propaganda, and that's what her film is. We can tell a lot about her agenda by what's in the film, but also what's not in it. And the fact that Sandberg and other proponents of the mass rape hoax never address these debunked stories reveals their basic, glaring dishonesty.
Well, finally, Ali, as you said, we and others have debunked this mass rape story time and time again, and yet they keep coming back with it. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I'll go back to what we've said all along. Claims that Black and brown men, colonized men, are sexual savages who rape white women and settler women is as old as colonialism. And this excuse has been used, or this lie has been used for centuries to justify the dehumanization, murder, and genocide of enslaved people, of colonized people, of indigenous people around the world. And it's that same narrative being recycled for a 21st century genocide. That is what's going on here. And it's simply a desperate effort to distract from the genocide, to distract from the student uprising, the student intifada that's going on all over the country. And I think Israel considers it to be the best, or they think their strongest card to play with more left-leaning, progressive, and liberal opinion in the West, where support for Israel is just crashing. But what it amounts to is vile, genocidal, atrocity propaganda, which is being used to justify mass murder of mostly the vast majority of the people being murdered in Gaza by Israel and the United States and Germany and their other allies are women and children. Men are being murdered, of course, and men are no more deserving of this fate. I'm not implying that, but the vast majority of victims are women and children. The people that Sheryl Sandberg and Hillary Clinton and other promoters of this vile propaganda claim to care about so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I know that took a long time and a lot of exhaustive research. Having to watch that film several times. I mean, these are the sacrifices that that we make at the Electronic Intifada. Thank you so much, Ali, for that work.
Thank you. And I just want to thank Tamara, because
Yeah.
I threw a lot of media at her over the last, I don't know how long it's been, I bet close to an hour. And she just did a tremendous job supporting me in doing this, as did Asa, and of course you and all our colleagues, David Sheen and others as well. So thank you all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.